Look at your life. You studied, you worked, you paid taxes, you did not commit crimes, you tried to be responsible. So why do you still feel screwed? The great Filipino humiliation ritual is waking up early, grinding all day, handing over your taxes, then watching the same people who took your money live like absolute kings. I've been working for more than a decade now, and I used to believe that if I just kept my head down, put in the hours, and played by the rules, things would eventually make sense. But if working hard automatically made people successful, Filipino workers would be some of the richest people on earth. If a private company took your money every month and gave you zero services in return, you'd call it a scam. When the government does it, you call it civic duty. You pay first world tax rates for third world infrastructure, and then you're told to be grateful for a free bag of rice or some canned goods during a typhoon. We tell poor Filipinos to get another job before we ask why one job cannot afford a decent life. We call it quote-unquote resilience, when sometimes it's really just adaptation to dysfunction. A country shouldn't need its citizens to be unbelievably resilient just to function normally. The deal was simple. You pay taxes and the government provides basic services. So what happens when you keep paying but the deal keeps getting worse? Taxes are not supposed to be a subscription fee to government dysfunction. Netflix sucks, cancel it. Gym sucks, cancel it. A restaurant sucks, you don't come back. Government sucks, you don't get to cancel the subscription. You don't get to opt out. There's this idea that if you're working, paying taxes, following the law, and not asking for trouble, you're doing your part. And you are. But there's a point where you start wondering why your side of the bargain is treated as mandatory while government side feels optional. You don't get to say, sorry, I don't feel like paying this month because I don't think you're doing a good job. But somehow, when public services are terrible, the response is often basically, well, that's just how things are. That's a pretty bizarre relationship when you think about it. And if you're an average Filipino middle-class NPC, it puts you in this exhausting middle ground. You are not poor enough to receive certain forms of assistance. You're not rich enough to simply ignore rising costs. You pay for private healthcare because public healthcare can be difficult. You send your kids to private schools because you want better options. You use private transportation because public transpo is so inconvenient. You pay for internet because you need it for work. You pay for security because you want to feel safe. You pay taxes and then pay again privately for things you expected your taxes to help provide. And try starting a small legitimate business or freelancing legally. The amount of paperwork, permits, line standing, and random fees just to earn an honest living. The system treats honest tax-paying citizens like criminals who need to prove their innocence with, dozens of different government clearances, while actual corrupt officials walk around with complete immunity. Some even travel abroad freely. They'll fine you for a small violation. They'll chase you for a late payment, but the big ones, the ones with the right last names or the right connections, quiet. Always quiet. Easy. You see ordinary Filipinos killing themselves with overtime, side hustles, overseas work, just to stay afloat. And then you see the people who never had to do any of that, living off the money those same people paid. The roads stay broken. The hospitals stay understaffed. But somehow, there's always money for another quote-unquote project, another trip. And whenever the next disaster happens, the next storm hits, what happens? Flood control budgets vanish into ghost projects. Confidential funds disappear into thin air. Performative but incompetent politicians show up with cameras, and then we start the calamity ayuda cycle all over again. When election season comes around, or when a crisis hits, the sudden appearance of small cash handouts or emergency bags feels insulting. It's your tax money being rebranded as personal charity from a politician's pocket, given back to you as breadcrumbs so you remain dependent on their goodwill. Check out how every time there's a disaster of flooding, media and government leaders praise the so-called Filipino resilience. Calling people resilient is just a cheap psychological trick to make you feel proud of surviving neglect. It conditions you to accept romanticized suffering instead of demanding accountability for misused government budgets. Bro, why are we so proud of being resilient when half the shit we're resilient against shouldn't exist in the first place? We congratulate people for surviving problems that should not exist. Look at how we talk about work in this country. Someone works 2 jobs, everyone says, grabe, sipag. Someone works overseas for 10 years and barely sees their family. Isa kang tunay na bayani. You're a family man. Respect. Or when someone works 12-hour days, grabe kugihan na niniyay lahi rajud. Imbahay. And yeah, sometimes that sacrifice is very, very admirable. But we rarely ask the second question. Why did this person have to sacrifice this much in the first place? I wouldn't attack Diskarte itself. Being resourceful is legit valuable. For sure. The problem is when every structural problem gets converted into a personal challenge. Filipinos are incredibly adaptable. That's a strength. Sure. But adaptability has a dark side. You can adapt to almost anything. Bad traffic, long commutes, brownouts, power outages, bureaucracy, politics, low wages, crowded, understaffed hospitals, expensive housing, poor infrastructure, and so on. I could go on and on. And after enough time, the abnormal becomes normalized. You stop asking, why is this like this? And you just start asking, how do I work around it? And if you complain, watch how fast people try to shut you down. A Filipino complains about wages, someone will say, well, at least you have a job. Someone complains about government services, well, at least we're not a war zone here. When someone complains about corruption, well, ganun talaga, every country has corruption. Someone complains about living costs, well, you just need to learn how to budget. Well, puro asa sa gobyerno. There's always another lower standard you're supposed to compare yourself against. And eventually, gratitude becomes a way to shut down legitimate criticism. You can be grateful to have a job and still think you're underpaid. You can love your country and still think its government is incompetent. A lot of people will say, lahat naman corrupt, like that makes it okay? The fuck? Like it's just the weather? The worst part isn't even the stealing. It's not stealing itself, but the casualness of it all. Like the way it's treated like normal. as if it's just how government works here. Like you're the strange one for still getting frustrated about all of these things. You live in your own country, yet foreigners on vacation or digital nomads often enjoy higher purchasing power and easier lifestyle access than the locals who work 60 hours a week here. There's a reason they're Geomaxxing here, right? Some passport bros, and a good portion of them were labeled losers back home, yet they're thriving here. So if the losers back in their homes are thriving here, what does that make us? The system is structured so that local labor is exported or exploited, while the infrastructure caters far more to tourist dollars than to the dignity of the citizens building the nation. Whenever people complain about the Philippines, somebody will eventually say, then leave. And obviously, leaving is a legitimate option. Millions of Filipinos have done exactly that. Filipinos working abroad is absolutely something to be proud of, to a certain extent. But there's another side to it. A country shouldn't have to export enormous numbers of its own workers for those workers to find better opportunities. There's something uncomfortable about a country where one of the most common solutions to dissatisfaction is just leave, instead of let's make this place better. Let's make this place better. And every election cycle, the same conversation happens, same promises, same trapo faces, elected by the uto-uto voters who never learn. Same disappointment 6 months later. Then we reset and do it again. Nabudol daw. Nabudol lang daw. So where does that leave you? You work, you pay, you obey, you adapt, you survive, dream, believe, survive. And then you're told to be proud of how resilient you are. Bro, why the fuck do we have to be this resilient? I don't ever want to raise a family, have a kid in a country where my kid needs to be resilient just to have a good life. You know, ever since I was a kid, Pinoy pride has never sat well with me. But Pinoy pride is such a fascinating phrase. Because apparently we're proud of how much bullshit we can survive. At some point, you have to ask yourself, are we celebrating Filipino excellence? Or are we celebrating how much humiliation Filipinos can endure without breaking? That's the great Filipino humiliation ritual.